Part 3, Chapter 1. Once more a change entered into my relations with Pan Wiadomski. I was finding it increasingly difficult to maintain contact with him. He had plunged suddenly into a new activity and was surrounded by a group of persons whose character and identity were for some time a complete mystery to me. I would come to him on one of my regular visits, only to find him locked in his room in consultation. I would wait for him by the hour in the long, narrow corridor, and invariably, when my patience gave out and I was about to go, he would come rushing from his room, unkempt, distraught, possessed, a pen stuck behind his ear, as if a strange instinct had warned him of my intended departure, and apologize hastily and incoherently, while begging me to return to him later in the day. I discovered before long the nature of Pan Wiadomski's new preoccupation. He was collaborating with a priest on nothing more nor less than a treatise designed to prove that Jews made use of Christian blood for the preparation of matzot for the Passover. In connection with his researches, he spent whole days in the company of scholars of dubious reputation. One of them, I established, was a theologian who had a smattering of Hebrew and knew all the dangerous passages in the Talmud, as well as those which dealt with goyim, necharim, minim, words which may be translated approximately as non-Jews, strangers, and heretics, but the exact meaning of which is no longer known, and similar matters. The special task of this theologian was to gather the theoretical material of the slanderous attack made by the anti-Semitic Roman writer Felix on the primitive Christians, to the effect that they employed the blood of children in their secret nocturnal feasts. Later on, the Christians turned the identical slander against the Jews. Another collaborator, a historian, was assigned to the collecting of historical data consisting of the records of trials for the crime of ritual murder, of confessions obtained or purported to have been obtained by the Inquisition under torture, and of sentences passed by secular and ecclesiastical courts. For himself, Pan Wiadomski reserved the high task of welding the hodgepodge into a coherent whole, indicating the transference of these habits and customs into the contemporaneous life of Jewry, and adding a running commentary of his own in which was to be reflected the protest and indignation of the Christian masses. I had no means of knowing whether this distinguished production was intended for home consumption or for export abroad, nor did I know whether it was planned actually to launch a blood ritual accusation against certain Jews, or merely to begin a general anti-Jewish agitation. Whatever the purpose, the business consumed all of Pan Wiadomski's time and energies. It need hardly be mentioned that as I became aware of his new enterprise, my calls became rarer and rarer. Finally, I suspended them altogether, and our work suffered a long interruption. Once again, I made up my mind to regard my connections with Pan Wiadomski as irrevocably terminated, and I did my best to forget him. But I should have known, in fact I did know, from previous experience, that the resolution was futile, and that the connections would be resumed as soon as he chose to honor my poor garret with his high presence. I should have known that there was no escape from the curious dual roles which Pan Wiadomski and I were apparently destined to play opposite each other. And I must confess that in spite of the disgust awakened in me by his latest enterprise, the old queer attraction was still there, as if I had been cast under a spell. It was really as though I could no longer do without the man. Let me be frank. I missed him. I longed for our regular nightly meetings, I remembered with nostalgia those winter evenings which we had spent summoning out of the past that once forgotten life which we had in common. Now that our connections were cut off, my modest life had lost, so it seemed to me, whatever had served to make it interesting and significant. For me, too, those fantastic incidents, born of fever and imagination, which Pan Wiadomski had woven about both of us, had become a simple necessity. My actual life, the present, had turned into something grey, pitiful, trivial, shot through with vanity and hatreds. I was asphyxiated by it. My spirit was fixed hungrily on the great events and passions which had filled that far-off time. I could not forget the streets of Jerusalem, the tumult of the temple courts, the winds that blew across the hills and valleys of Judea, from all of which I had suddenly been carried off, irrevocably it seemed, by the break in my relationship with the Pan. For months now I had lived in that world and breathed its air. One consistent consolation worked at the back of my mind. The forest would keep on calling to the wolf. Pan Wiadomski would succumb to the pull of the ancient multicolored world and forget the driveling rancors of the contemporaneous world which now occupied his attention. He would remember suddenly the catastrophic drama in which he had been playing a part and return to resume his role. Exactly this was what happened. The weather changed. The mild gusts of wind which herald the spring and Passover began to blow across the country, and Pan Wiadomski shook off his awareness of the surrounding life like an animal which shakes off its winter covering. He sloughed from about him the Pan of the 20th century and emerged once more as the Cornelius of eternity. There ensued an odd inversion of the situation. Around the time of the Jewish and Christian religious festivals, Pan Wiadomski began to act even more queerly than before. He would have had me believe that he had dropped his interest in the historic work. Instead of hiding from his colleagues his relationship with me, he tried to hide from me his relationship with them. He paid me frequent visits in my wretched garret. He spent whole days wandering in my company through the poorest Jewish sections. With my help, he hunted up former acquaintances of his in the old city. He unearthed the tailors and shoemakers he had known years before. We crept down lightless and airless cellars. We astonished and terrified Jewish housewives occupied at that season with the cleansing of home and utensils in preparation for the Passover. I don't know what it is, he confided to me, but when the Passover days come, I simply have to feel myself surrounded by Jews. I just can't do without them. They bring back the pre-festival days in Jerusalem. There, too, the time which ushered in the Passover was full of bustle and preparation. They came streaming toward the city from every corner of the land, they, their families, and their sheep, bringing this Passover sacrifice. The streets were filled with farmers and peasants and pilgrims. Jerusalem became so gay and lively that when this season of the year comes round, I feel downright homesick, and I have to go back to my Jews. I have to feel them about me. I have to peep into their homes. They put me back, once more, into Jerusalem. It's enough to look into their faces. I seem to see again the swarming alleys about the temple area. He spoke dreamily, his half-closed eyes focused on remote, invisible scenes. On his yellow, wrinkled, parchment-like features lay the fresh light of the spring sun, which shone on the dirty, noisy streets of Warsaw. The few solitary hairs which adorned his skull stood up as if to take the light. There was vain longing in his voice as he declaimed the words of an unknown poet, "O Jerusalem, the spring entereth thy gates, accompanied by the footsteps of death." "What do you mean?" I asked, astonished. "Oh, nothing, just a mood of mine. Spring, you understand. When the spring approaches, I sicken for Jerusalem. If I cannot pass through her gates, I must at least haunt the dwelling places of her children. Would you like to see Judah, the man of Kiriot, Judah Ish Kiriot? Come with me, we'll visit him. Oh yes, when the Passover comes, I look up my old friends. I quite forgot to tell you that my friend Ish Kiriot lives in Warsaw. I had thought that Pan Wiadomski could never surprise me again, but this was quite new. I asked him to repeat. What? Judah Ish Kiriot in Warsaw too? Why, certainly. I knew him the moment I saw him. I recognized his face among 10,000. And not only he, Simon is here, him whom they also called Peter. I came across him in the Jewish streets of Warsaw. So many of them are here, the men I knew in the alleys of Jerusalem, in the temple courts, and in the lower city. It is extraordinary. Whenever I come into a crowd of Jews, I seem to know all of them. It's as though I'd had dealings with each one personally. I know their manners, their gestures, their customs, their proud, stiff bearing, their obstinacy, their unbreakable will. I stare at them in the midst of their huckstering and chaffering here in the old market, and it seems to me that any moment they'll throw off their long gabardines and stand before me in their white robes, lean, fiery children of the desert, with dark faces, blazing eyes, long hair, thronging about me as they did in the temple alleys on festival days. Often I feel that it's some blunder of destiny which transported them here into these cold streets, with their shops and stands, with muddy snow underfoot and chilly winds blowing through them. It was thus that I encountered my old friend, Judah Ish Kiriot. Judah Ish Kiriot, I mumbled incredulously. You can meet him if you like. He has his place on the old market. Then, one day, just before we set out from his house, Pan Wiadomski drew from a corner an extraordinary possession which I had not seen before, a long black cape with the hood of a Capuchin monk atop. I had not suspected that Pan Wiadomski had hidden anything from me. "But what do you want that for?" I stammered. "It isn't cold today." "Hush," he answered. "I don't want all Jerusalem to know that the hegemon is visiting Judah Ish Kiriot. Such matters are done in secret." Pan Wiadomski drew the hood over his head, and we ventured forth, and I need hardly remark that this odd garb only served to draw the attention of the passers-by. He led me to the old market and paused before an ancient, dilapidated house, which was obviously on the point of collapse and would no doubt have collapsed long ago, except that the pressure of its equally ancient neighbors maintained it in a precarious erectness. The walls had once been painted red, the shutters green. Pan Wiadomski looked cautiously right and left to note if he was being observed. Then he took me by the hand and conducted me down the narrow, crumbling steps into the cellar.